we should move into the general discussion period. So if anyone has questions for any of the speakers, feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll ask the three other speakers, Ruby, Cameron, and Dan, to stand by. And I'll just note in general that this session is entirely early career presenters and scientists, so yay for early career folks. I will start off the discussion. Where do I want to start? Maybe with some of the questions that we had in the chat from before. So Cameron, we had a question from Dean Epler, asking about the SPA percentages that you had quoted in your talk. Do those percentages push you toward more rock and regolith samples rather than it being something you would see in individual rock samples? So again, it's like, do you have any idea what the form of any sort of SPA would be in these sites?
And of course, like I said, all of the like SPA material, it's probably been there for a while, and there's been a lot of other impacts that have happened since then. So it's all mixed up and probably included in some breccias and all sorts of stuff. So I think, well, I'm not entirely sure what it really pushes us more towards. You, it it points to a need for a very diverse range of samples to be able to pick out SPA material. Um, uh, I feel like there's a fairly low probability of finding like, oh, here's one big chunk of like mantle material or something like that that's from SPA. It's gonna be small clasts included in things and all sorts of stuff like that. Um, so it'll be a lot of like varied samples that we'll have to collect and then do a bunch of statistical analyses to try to pick out exactly what is SPA material, what's not. Hopefully, if it is, mantle material, modified or unmodified, it'll be fairly unique to anything else we've measured from the moon, so that'll probably help. But yeah, thank you for the question. That was really good.
Okay, and if any of the other speakers have thoughts, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so relevant to that, I just want to bring up the endurance mission concept that was flagged by the recent decadal survey as a high priority, possibly a high priority pursuit related to Artemis. So for those that aren't familiar with it, the Endurance rover would be a long-range rover that would land somewhere in the interior of SPA, and then collect samples along a fairly long traverse on its way to rendezvous with Artemis astronauts. So something like that would significantly increase the diversity of samples returned from Artemis. And the other advantage is that you would be collecting samples from kind of diverse locations within SPA that you can tie to a specific location, as opposed to everything you're going to be collecting from SPA down in the Artemis region is essentially kind of out of place and diluted ejecta. So collecting SPA materials from the interior of SPA from known locations that you've kind of prioritized through remote sensing analyses, you'd have good context. You'd collect kind of a whole stratigraphic column of material from the base and center to the kind of rim and then exterior in the Artemis zone. So I think a kind of complementary robotic mission like that, again, as suggested as a high priority by the decadal survey, I think that would be a really powerful tool for kind of supplementing and enhancing the science return of Artemis.
All right. More samples is what we need. Not just samples, but more samples. Okay.
I guess the other thing is, of course, that
sure.
timeline's probably not realistic for Artemis 3. That's a longer term thing. So slightly less relevant to the discussion today, but just something to keep in mind.
Okay, so I have a question for Dan, but it also ties into points from Cameron and Ruby's talks. That the three of you talked about the distribution of plage and pyroxene or FeO, and I may have noted this down wrong, but Dan, I think in your talk you said that pyroxene abundance or like integrated band depth increases towards the poles. but Cameron, you said, I think that your data showed that it decreases towards the poles, and Ruby, I think that you said something similar. So A, did I get that wrong? And B, if I didn't, then can any of you, maybe Dan, since you were the oddball here, can you explain why you found a difference?
I didn't specifically talk about an increase in pyroxene towards the pole. I did show a plot that showed that in the Kaguya plagioclase abundance data, there's a strong latitudinal dependence. So you get very high plagioclase at higher latitudes. And I am curious how much of that is tied to actual mineralogy versus how much is more. We know from like the Lola albedo products that there is this latitudinal dependence with albedo. Some of that might not be mineralogy. Some of it may be due to kind of thermal environments, or I mean, who knows, even kind of intergrain frosts, or there's all weird stuff that happens at the pole that we don't know. Space weathering is really different at high latitudes. So I'm not certain that latitudinal dependence and plagioclase abundance we see is real in all cases, especially in the collection of highest latitude sites, maybe south of like 86 or 87. But what I did show was that when we looked at average spectra from the whole moon, the South Pole, and that's latitudes above 80 degrees, and the North Pole, the South Pole had the highest average band depths of those three. So even considering the whole moon, which includes all of the Mare regions on the near side. So there is a mafic anomaly associated with the South Pole. A lot of that is probably associated with South Pole Lake and ejecta. So the South Pole is on average more mafic than like the Far Side Highlands, for instance. But again, it is. I think that maybe like 20 to 30% SPA ejecta number is probably pretty reasonable. With again like SPA ejecta itself not necessarily being ultra mafic. SPA ejected a whole column, including tens of kilometers of crustal material, which is mostly felspathic as well. So the abundance of mafic minerals will be certainly smaller than the abundance of SPA ejecta across the pole.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Anyone else want to jump in and talk about abundance and distribution? Otherwise, we can move on. Okay, so I have kind of a general question, and this is sort of cheating because it's with an eye towards the document that we're trying to develop as a product of this meeting. So we're trying to find any sort of like interesting, notable qualities about specific sites within the 13. And is there like one thing that's really specific about one site in particular that's not in the other ones? And this session was great because you talked about specific, SPA abundances or specific volatiles in each site. But is there anything that you didn't note or that you just want to reinforce again about a specific site that we should note and make sure that we capture in our documents? And I'll start with Ruby, put you on the spot. You can say no, but I just want to make sure, since we do have people keeping track of this discussion, if there's something that we need to make sure that we have in our document about a specific site or sites.
Sure. No, this is a really, really great question. And this is something that I did not mention in my talk because it was kind of off topic. But something that potentially David Kring mentioned this to me at one point. But at the site that's named Connecting Ridge, so it's connecting kind of Gerlach and Henson and Shackleton. There's the potential to approach the rim of Shackleton crater. And when you're at that vantage point, there is a really cool opportunity to actually peer into Shackleton and witness, with your astronaut eyes, the stratigraphy present potentially on the inside of Shackleton crater. And I think there's a really cool opportunity for potential like handheld remote sensing instruments to be deployed in that instance. I think that's very cool and kind of sci-fi and dreamy, but also entirely possible.
Cool. Oh, good answer. Thanks. Jenna, how about you?
Yeah. I guess I am Team Faustini. I definitely think it has a lot of volatile potential. It could be possible to navigate through it. It would be a challenge, and it does have some illumination, but I really like Faustini. I think it would be really cool to study. I think it would be cool to study for like Artemis 4 too. I think it would be great to go back to Faustini, but that's just my personal opinion. But anyway, in terms of traversability, I think peak near Shackleton is probably, in terms of slope, is likely one of the better choices. But for scientific potential, Faustini.
Okay, Cameron, how about you? Any particular scientific potential of sites that you didn't get to mention or you want to just highlight again?
Oh man. I guess if you're looking for SPA material, the Gerlach Kosher Massif is like right there on the rim. Um, so that is the one that I personally like if you're trying to look for SPA material. But if you're looking for sort of a broader range of science objectives, I think some of the ones that are closer towards the poles, like Connecting Ridge or Peak near Shackleton, you get more maybe potential for volatiles and all that kind of stuff as well that I think would be good science targets and stuff.
Awesome. Okay, and Dan, we have 13 seconds left in our discussion session. So anything you want to add to that? You have 13 well, you have 11 seconds now.
We're going to do great science no matter where we go. One thing I would just like to mention is that the only place we see any even hint of evidence for volcanic material is around a month. So that's one to kind of throw into the ring if you're looking to kind of characterize differences in volcanic processes between like the near side and far side and South Pole.
Thanks, Dan. Good addition. Okay, and the last thing I'll note, because I've been asking myself all day, Ruby put in the chat, what is the correct pronunciation of de Gerlach? We did have Hannes put in the chat earlier today that it's pronounced de Gerlach, I think. So I'm just throwing that out there. Hannes, sorry if I mispronounced your pronunciation. Okay, so thank you. Yeah, exclamation points from Hannes. I guess that's good. Thank you, all the speakers in the session. All the speakers today were great. And I will now turn it back to Sam for his closing remarks.